today, FOWSIA Abdulkadir, and we're particularly lucky also to be welcoming Juweria Ali as a highly knowledgeable discussant for this talk. So it just basically falls to me to introduce our chair, Dr. IDIL Osman, who's been a particular pleasure because she's a former SOAS colleague. She holds a PhD from the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University. She's now an assistant professor at the University of Leicester, where she works on global media, communication, migration and development. Her recent book, Media, Diaspora and the Somali Conflict, looks at the Somali conflict as a case study to reveal how the media plays a role in transnationalizing conflicts and how it offers valuable insights into migration, diaspora communities and development. And it's been praised for its rigor, courage and humanity. IDIL doesn't just study media, she also does media. She regularly provides expert commentary in a host of major media outlets. So we're in excellent hands. Over to you, IDIL.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that wonderful introduction, generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here amongst all of you guys, and I want to extend a particular thank you to Ayan for bringing us all together. Every year, I think, the strength of the Somali Week Convention grows and grows, and I'm very happy to see it flourish in the way it has. So I'm just going to introduce FOWSIA and Juweria, and then I'm going to let them take over. So we'll begin with FOWSIA Sheikh Abdulkadir. She is the first Deputy Commissioner of the Somali Regional State for Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Ethiopia. She's also the Research Director of Hankal Institute, which is a non-profit think tank in the Somali region of Ethiopia. And then I'll quickly introduce Juweria as well. And she is Dr. Juweria Ali, who is a research fellow at the University of Westminster, focusing on oil and gas in Ethiopia's Somali region. I'm very conscious of the fact that we're starting with very little time, so I'm hoping that you guys will elaborate on your own positionality, your expertise, and in addition to what you want to say for today. So I'm going to hand it over to you, FOWSIA first, and then Juweria.
Thank you. Thank you very much, IDIL. And I'm really honored to be sitting here with Dr. Juweria and Dr. IDIL. I think it's on. Oh, okay. I also want to extend a heartfelt thank you to Ayan, who is a colossal of a woman, and the growth of the Somali Week. My name is FOWSIA Abdulkadir. As mentioned, I have several roles I play, but the current and the most prominent one is being part of a subnational Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Somali region of Ethiopia. So my talk, since we don't have much time, I will speak about that, and also trying to work with researchers like Juweria and them to kind of create data and address some data deficit in that region. So reflections, I'm glad that Professor Abdulkadir and Professor Ahmed started to talk about the importance of the past and the importance of the history. And I think your question, Doctor, was really relevant in that we do live with contested narratives, counter narratives. Everybody's swearing on the Quran that this is the truth of Rehibil, right? So imagine that tumultuous backdrop and that tumultuous history, and the map that Dr. Abdulkadir showed us about the Somali inhabited territories and how the Somali region was parceled out in different times across history in portions without the consent of the people who live there. So just imagining that, there was, I think, some American song that said, "Where I have been, what I have seen, make me who I am today." So that region is tumultuous history. It's too complex to delve into it tonight. But I think suffice it to say that those ideals that Somali Nimo, the ideals of nationalism, the ideals that, as Abdi talked about, started in Jijjiga, started in Harar, started in Dirirawa. So fast forward to all the things that have happened since. Because the parceling of the Somali regional state started in 1897 all the way to 1950 in portions. So you can only imagine the resistance, the fight, every stage. So we're not gonna dwell on that, but a lot has happened. People were coerced. The border was never really, legally demarcated. The Italians, the British, the Ethiopian expansionist agenda, those were all kind of glossed over, and then the African Union decided when we're gonna leave the borders as the Europeans left it. So here you have a region that is as big as the country of Uganda, if not bigger. That is geographically biggest region in the Ethiopian territory. I used to read a lot of documents that said it was the second largest, second to Oromia, but geographically, the truth is the Somali territory in Ethiopia is the largest region in Ethiopia. And then for the first time in its history in the early 90s, EPRDF brought ethnic federalism. For the first time in the history of the region, then you have had a region called Somali Regional State. Before, you couldn't even claim to be a Somalia and an Ethiopia. But the entirety of the Somali inhabited territories were given an administration and the name of Somali Regional State. And then, EPRDF went about marin hababin ethnic federalism, marin hababiye. It wasn't really implemented to its potential. It had potential where every region could do administrative work in their own language, could have a local autonomy to deal with their citizens' needs. But there was a very coercive and politicized history in the Somali region. There was something that I call isribeksi. The human rights violations that happened to the Somalis in Ethiopia, I don't think happened to other ethnic groups in Ethiopia. Notwithstanding the latest Tigray war, which really, brought a whole lot of millions of people suffering. The Somalis were the only place that had, something called Jelo Gaden, that you kind of go down and, you're Somali, you're not Ethiopian, you go down, and you kind of have an entire clan made of people who are, I remember talking to my Juweria saying, you got picked up and put in jail. So a lot of human rights violations occurred since immemorial. It didn't just start with the EPRDF era. A lot has happened under every regime, starting from Emperor Menelik and the formation of the Ethiopian state, and Haile Selassie and the Derg, which was actually known as the Red Terror, and then EPRDF era. Things changed in Ethiopia in 2018. There was a political change. There was a political leadership change at the federal level, somewhat. But the Somali region experienced a real regime change, notwithstanding the deep state. The deep state and the districts and the villages have the same people in it, so it's Alawi. But there was a regime change in Jigjiga. Another thing happened, which was a blessing for the region, and that was ONLF surrendered its guns. ONLF was the target that was on people's backs, whether it was used against your neighbor, whether it was used against another clan. You were either a supporter, or you were a cell, or you were an informant for ONLF. It was just the thing to kind of label, and terms like nabadid. No human being will refuse peace. It's sane world. But terms like nabadid was one of the things that people were accused of in under the EPRDF era. But when ONLF then surrendered its guns, it also culminated with another thing. EPRDF under Meles Zenawi suspended the civil society's proclamation, where you could do rights work, where you could work on women's rights, on child rights, and all that. That got suspended. You could dig a well, you could give people water and food, you could not work in human rights. after the political changes in Addis Ababa, 2019, what they call the Proclamation of Civil Societies was reinstated. Now, what happened then in the Somali region is people now got really space to talk. Civil society organizations started to form, people started to talk about what to do, how to move forward. And there were some surveys done by NGOs, one particularly called Customer Development. They did some listening exercises through the support of Conciliation Resource, and people overwhelmingly said, we want to deal with the past. And this, I think, is what kind of ties with the talks of the two professors as well. For people to move forward, you need to address the past. And overwhelmingly, the civil society in the Somali region said, I think one study that CASMA did, 68% of the people said, we want to address what happened to us. Because the human rights violations that happened in the Somali region, when, everybody knows, to the extent that Human Rights Watch was taking satellite pictures of burned villages. So they said, we need that. And they formed a task force that consisted of opposition, such as the ONLF party, the WSLF party, the Freedom and Something party, the current ruling party, and civil society and traditional leaders. They created a task force. They actually then drafted the beginnings and most of what became the legal proclamation that the regional parliament passed. At that time, in 2019, 2020, Ethiopia had a federal reconciliation commission that was in existence for like 2 years and then got disbanded. But even when that was in existence, the civil society pressure on the Somali regional leadership was, whatever happens at the federal level, we do need a process that addresses, documents what happened to us, by us, for us. And to the credit of the current parliament and its leadership, when that proclamation draft went to them, they said, okay. At that point, I think the name for the commission was Hawilmarin iyo Haqiijin, or Haqiijin iyo Hawilmarin. The regional parliament dared to say, okay, we are going to have a subnational regional commission that needs to document this. So the proper legal name, actually the name is just the whole mandate in a name. It is the Commission Kabaarista Tacadiyada ka dhacay deegaanka dib u heshiisiinta iyo xaalmarinta dhibanayaasha. The commission, so the entire mandate is on the name. The commission to investigate human rights violations, reconciliation, reparation for victims of the Somali region. So it's really a broad proclamation. It got passed in summer of 2021. After a year, they then nominated 7 commissioners, a general commissioner and 6 deputy commissioners to document what happened, who did it happen to, why, by whom, where, and the types. The proclamation actually says the types of human rights violations need to be. There is no amnesty in this proclamation, but there is reconciliation. So I happen to be one of the deputy commissioners, and we embarked on something that is the processes of a transitional justice. Transitional justice, you all know, is a broader process that when you have so many things that the legal framework is overwhelmed, then you have a transition. It is a process. It's not one thing. It's a mechanism. It's a process. It has truth finding, seeking the truth. You have to then kind of talk about accountability. This commission is mandated to recommend prosecution. We cannot prosecute anybody, but we can kind of say anybody who has done egregious human rights can be. And then you have to talk about how do you reconcile and what to be reconciled. Reform strategy, because we're dealing with a region that it is own state, citizens that have been abused by its own state. So it's slightly different than a civil war and factions and things like that. It was the Ethiopian state and its proxy in Jigjiga, regional state, have done this. And there was an insurgency, yes, armed insurgency, but the counter-insurgency measures were really egregiously outside of any human rights framework. And that's what brought just that whole history for me, was to say, how did we get here? How did the commission get established? The mandate of the commission is from 1991 to 2018, which is the era of the EPRDF. And there's very practical reasons for it. Most of the victims who survived can be witnesses for what has happened. The region is too poor to sort of say, let's do a 60 or 80 year documentation. These things need resources. So it was really practical to sort of say, there's a regime change, there's also a leadership change in Addis Ababa, and sell this idea of we want to kind of investigate what, because however historically marginalized or human rights violations were occurring in the region, under EPRDF it escalated to a different level. So it was really practical to focus on the 1991-2018 era. There's nothing stopping us from contextualizing. You cannot tell the truth without going back to history. So as a commission, there's nothing stopping us from starting when this land was parceled out to the Emperor of Ethiopia to talk about that. Also, post-2018, the ethnic federalism has borders with ethnic groups. Somali region borders with the Afar region, it borders with Oromia region, and there are always skirmishes and displacements in those borders also. So post 2018, a lot of people got displaced in a zone called City that borders with the Afar region. And there are a lot of people who, as citizens, need to be talked to. So hopefully we will be able to sort of frame a way to deal with the past, particularly, what has happened to the people, to document it, to recommend prosecution, to recommend reform, because I don't know if you're familiar with the state machinery that really worked under the EPRDF. Had the military, the federal military, they had a regional militia, and then it got something called Leo Police, which is alternative police, militarized police, that came into the picture in 2007 and after. So there's a lot of complexity and things were changing. So even what was happening under the EPRDF had been kind of like changing in its atrocities. At the beginning, it was the insurgency in the bush, and armed guys, militia and military going to the bush after them. As time progressed, it changed into, okay, we need militia from the communities, we need this, we need that. But then Abale happened. There's a village called Abale where the ONLF killed some oil workers, Chinese oil workers and Ethiopians. And post Abale, it also culminated with when the Ethiopians went into Somalia as peacekeepers. There was the whole war on terror and containing Somalia and what is happening. Building on that, the Leo Police was also unleashed on the people to securitize the whole place. When the civil society proclamation was revoked, this region became cordoned. International Red Cross was kicked out. All the international NGOs were kicked out. It was securitized. It was a no-go zone. So as you can then appreciate, even when we start from 1991, come to 2005, come to 2006, 2007, the human rights violations escalated. We went to work. We have documented in the truth-seeking phase 50,000 statements from survivors and their families. When you kind of create a questionnaire for the context of the Somali culture, we don't speak in individuals, we speak in families, family unit, what happened. There are people whom their parents were taken and haven't been seen. There are missing people. We have young men and women who, the last time they saw their father, they were 5 years old. Nobody, they're still missing. So when you talk to somebody who survived, then you ask them, we were asking them, did this happen to you? Did it happen to your family members? Who did it happen? So in that 50,000 statements, when you think about individual human rights cases, there are about over 64,000 individual stories in it. We documented that. What has happened is really keeping us sleepless in terms of, what was done to these people. I mean, you all heard about Abdulkadir, but people were tortured in a way that they will put hot pepper in a plastic bag and then put it over the head of the person, suffocate them. Hot pepper on women's private parts. Rape was used as a woman, as a weapon in Bin al-Bur. There was a grave for a woman that was raped and buried alive while standing up like this. Her bones are still stretched. She was buried standing up. A pregnant mother was buried up to here and orally raped by multiple people. So the stories are horrendous that are coming out. But I'm glad we are going to be able to write something and hopefully recommend something. The other thing that reparations, the other thing we stumbled over is, as I said, the region is really big. It is 95 districts, 11 zones, 95 districts, 6 city councils. We went to every district and city council and documented. We couldn't do like census, talk to everybody, but we really did. Very poor infrastructure, no roads. When it rains, the little bridges that exist are washed away. But we were able to reach, we were able to talk to women only, we were able to document what happened to women, we were able to document what happened to children. Women were giving birth in jail. We spoke to a woman who said she thought she was going to the bathroom and the baby came out and he survived. We spoke to a woman who gave birth and her mother was helping her give birth and the mother was holding the baby and they broke into the house, grabbed that baby and threw the baby over the fence. And after the birth, the woman they didn't even have a way for her to, whatever comes out after the baby didn't come out properly. But the soldiers dragged her to the courtyard under the sun. Every single male in the household was killed in front of the mother and that daughter. She never had another baby. And every time she sees a soldier, she was fainting. We had to bring her from the village and bring her in a car and cover her eyes because every roadblock has a soldier with a uniform. So so sad. Anyways, so we were able to, I wanted to make the point of you could not address reparations, immediate reparations, because the TRC process, we will have a reparation strategy at the end of it. But when you see people like that, or people who didn't eat for 2 weeks, it becomes irrelevant for you to say, so what happened under the EPRDF, what kind of human rights violations. So we ended up going back to the drawing boards, writing a best practice framework for the regional government to find a way for us to triage the needs of these people immediately. So we ended up the commission signing an MOU with 14 regional bureaus. The offices are called bureaus at the regional level. So the Bureau of Livestock, the Bureau of Health, the Bureau of Emergency Preparedness, the Bureau of Skills Training and Jobs. We had an MOU that says, okay, if we identify these people from remote areas that are in need of your services, they're not going to wait to be referred and wait, we will triage them. And they agreed, and we have been addressing mainly healthcare needs of people. So in the process, and in the proclamation also talks about emergency reparations in that sense. So we've been simultaneously, as we are documenting these stories, also providing emergency reparations. We also try to, those 60,000 statements, multiple lines of evidence to corroborate. We were doing key informants with people who witnesses some of these things, and also focus group discussions. What happened to the women didn't really come out as it should during the statements, but when we deliberately did outreach and women-only dialogues across the zones and sat with women, then we were able to. And not necessarily, how many women were raped is really irrelevant. The way we framed our questions is, do you know somebody who was raped? You can never ask a Somali woman if she was raped. But also, for me, what was important was, what conditions do they live with now? And what kind of help do they need? So the medical help comes up. So I know in Village X, so many people, some of them were held as sex slaves by the soldiers. Some of them have children. Married woman with 3 children gets raped. She has another 2 or 3 children. The husband divorces her. She's all of a sudden now, raising kids that she cannot really afford to raise. Or they are stigmatized and called names. So you have to pay attention to the specific needs of specific groups. Children who are ostracized because they are offsprings of rape, or even offsprings of rape from a non-Somali, are being raised in the hinterlands. So the needs are vast. We are in the thick of now that we have the data, trying to write up. So justice, peace, you need peace to even speak about, do I need to look back? So, in the literature, transitional justice, there is all kinds of, I went straight to the practical stuff, so I didn't really dwell on the TJ literature, but, justice or peace. Can you have peace for a long time without really addressing past injustices? Can you even entertain the questions of injustice if there is no peace? So we are facing a region that has a very fragile peace, but a region that also people know who did what to whom. So the peace you have is so fragile that revenge killing can erupt anytime. So when we brought the idea of the commission to people, before the data collection, we had to have dialogues with people. And it was like, ما Ethiopia عدالة سيري. So people were really weary of, when is the other shoe gonna drop? Is this real? Are we going to have a commission that will document what happened to us, and then a state that will respond to what they did? And we said, we will document your stories, and we will table it back to the parliament that mandated this, and we will see what comes out of it. At a minimum, we will have a historical record written, at a minimum, which this region has never had that opportunity to write its own history, that history of misery and suffering is going to be documented in a very evidence-based way. The other questions and the challenge that we also faced was, why 1991? Everybody and their grandmother knows this region's problems didn't start in 1991. Why are you people talking about 1991? I was in Moyale doing some of the outreach, and an elder guy was in tears, and he said, we forgot about what Haile Selassie did to us. Why are you reminding us? And then telling us, oh no, that's not the mandate of the commission. So these people live with a lot of trauma from generations, and there's going to be generational trauma healing needed. The other thing that is needed, Ahmed was talking about climate change. When I speak to other Ethiopians, I tell them that when and if Ethiopia gets into a TJ process, you guys have farms that you can pinpoint and say this farm belonged to so-and-so, and you know, with the Somali territory, livestock perished due to mainly state orchestrated condoning the livestock so that they will control people, but also climate change. So that, you know, if you just think about one example, Rerhebe or Abdulkadir Sheikh Musa, several hundred camels were looted and taken from those two families. The state of Ethiopia, I think, is too poor to be compensating, but we have to come up with a way that people are compensated. We have to come up with a report. So I just want to kind of give you a picture of the challenges we are facing, but the determination that this region has decided to document this story. I think it's commendable. It's historical, and it can provide lessons learned for the rest of Ethiopia, for the rest of Somali territories, and for the African Union transitional justice policies, because I think there was something in Nigeria as a subnational TJ that I don't know what came out of it, but I would say as a subnational one, I think in Africa, this is it. So we need to make sure that this is done in a way that is evidence-based, and it's done in a way that talks about the suffering of the people and how to not repeat that. I think it's the non-reoccurrence part of TJ that is very useful. It's not just documenting, it's preventing that it should not come back. What has happened shouldn't happen again. So I know I'm touching in multiple things and touching some of the challenges, but I think the potential for having a TJ process in the Horn of Africa can provide a lot of opportunities for all of us to scholarly study and also promote it. Ethiopia decided to have a working group for transitional justice at the federal level. They created a green paper, they consulted on it, there was a white paper, there was a policy drafted. The policy at the House of Ministers last year approved it. And the next phase of it was for the working group now to come up with the legal framework to have this operationalized. They got suspended. TJ ain't happening at the federal level. But we are hopeful that we will be able to complete this work and table it soon. I think I will let Juweria, who is much more knowledgeable than I am, to come in and maybe address some of the theoretical part, but also to make this a little bit more interactive if we have enough time and ask questions. Over to you.
I think for the sake of time, we should probably just go straight to questions, and then I can just offer my reflections as part of the answers. So let's do that, because there's just not much time.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take the chair's liberty and ask you some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so first you mentioned that there is sort of a lack of continental level happenings or occurrences of transitional justice. I mean, as far as I can remember, as far back as South Africa, and the National Transition Justice Commission that Desmond Tutu led, and and then you had the Gacaca system in Rwanda, and all of those are from, you know, the early 90s. So probably 80% of the people here in the room don't even remember that or weren't even born then. So we're talking about a system, or at least a record that is at the continental level out of date. So how important is it to keep a record of what you guys are doing and publishing it, not just for the Somali region and Ethiopia, but for the continent as a whole?
Just a couple of minutes and then maybe Juweria can chime in. I think it's important in the sense that you're right. South Africa had a national TRC, so did Rwanda, so did the Gambia. Tunisia also had something, but they were early on. And there were a lot of gaps in what was happening. And I know the Gacaca system worked, and, you know, so this is going to be something that is fresh in the Horn of Africa, and the Horn of Africa has its own issues. So I think, but it's subnational also, because the South Africa one, the Rwanda one, the Tunisia, Gambia, they were all national. Liberia, Sierra Leone, they were all national. So this is a slightly different, but it's the same process. It's the, you know, every TRC is kind of like a social project, social research project, where context is going to dictate. You can learn from what happened or what worked where. And most of TRCs, you know, the success rate is really limited. But contextually, it has to work for the context. So it has to be contextualized. And this being a subnational one, in a state like Ethiopia with over 100 million people, where the discipline of history, the association of the Ethiopian historians was recently established, because there is so much contention and challenging each other within Ethiopia in terms of history and many ethnic groups. So I think if this is taken up by Ethiopia, it can be a lot of lessons for the rest of, but it's a subnational one. And we have to now, the challenge we have is also balancing Sharia, and the law of the land. Because at the end of the day, the people who want justice need to trust the system. And they're not going to trust a state-led only. And also, just like anywhere in the Somali territories, there are plural legal frameworks at play. The Somali region has a Sharia court that deals with all the social issues. So if we come up and say this is going to be looked at through the lens of the Ethiopian legal framework or criminal code, it won't work for our people. Our people need to see that. They also want to see the hair in it, even though the hair has no business anywhere in justice, especially for gender. But still, we need to take the good things about all that and walk that balancing walk as a commission. You know, I cannot stand up there and say it's all about feminism. Then nobody's going to take me seriously in the Somali region. So we need to balance, because the justice is not for me or Juweria. The justice is for the masses who might really buy into the hair and their core belief of Sharia. So it will be an additional value to really document this, and we will try and do that by also trying to do a multiple lines of evidence, not just one line. But I think the subnationality of it, the Somali territory part of it, Somali is now trying to, you know, we, in our experience sharing, we brought Jama, who was part of the Somali reconciliation framework drafting team, Jama Ige. And, you know, one of the things that we're staying away from communal conflicts. We're dealing with state-sponsored violations and not dealing with so sorry.
Juweria.
Thank you for your question, Edo. I think there's so much to say on that, and just to pick up on the issue of trust. I think the case of the Somali region, or at Ethiopia, at the very least, presents a very difficult case, or an example of doing transitional justice. The military has always served as a primary pillar of state authority in Ethiopia, and that really complicates things. So the military represents, or the security sector, this kind of this permanent sort of structure that survives every new ruling system. So you've got the Menelik era, the Haile Selassie era, the monarchy, then the Derg, then you've got the EPRDF, and then now the prosperity era. The military is kind of this permanent sort of figure that remains unchanged in the security sector and its imperatives, but the ruling system or the politics changes. And it links to this whole temporal issue when it comes to doing transitional justice work. So with the commission, for instance, the time frame starts from the EPRDF era, 1991. Of course, abuses were committed. We're talking about historical violence were committed under the Derg, under Haile Selassie's era, and so forth. But under each regime, it's the previous. So, like yesterday's, peacemakers are tomorrow's perpetrators, and vice versa. So, thinking like I like to think of this like with Foucault's regime of truth. So, at any given time, there's a politically acceptable discourse on who is a perpetrator and who is, and it links back to some of the stuff we were discussing earlier on with the two professors presenting. There are some, and I think Dr. Jama, comment. I think so. That's a real challenge. Somebody from the Derg era, or at the time of the Derg, for instance, the monarchy was demonized as this villain, this terrible, system that committed mass abuses, whereas they were committing the Red Terror themselves. Again, unprecedented levels of violence. Then the EPRDF comes to power, and the Derg were villainized day and night, televised. In fact, the generals from the Derg era were put on trial, so some form of transitional justice. And the EPRDF presented themselves as liberating nations and nationalities and undoing historical violence, redressing historical grievances of nations and nationalities and peoples who've been oppressed, like the Somalis in Ethiopia. And then, things, tables turned a couple of years later. We won't go into the history, but then they started committing the abuses themselves. Then 2018 happens, and all of a sudden it's, the EPRDF committed, terrible abuses, but then we're going back to glorifying and memorializing the Derg, which were just demonized for about 30 years or so. Again, this is linked to the political objectives of the Prime Minister at that given time, because it suits his, political project to glorify the Derg. And then, so it's politics that really plays into things, and it's really difficult for someone like FOWSIA doing the transitional justice work on a practical level, but also for victims themselves in how they think about justice and in what context as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's also the difficulty is also identifying who's a victim and who's a perpetrator, because many a times people are simultaneously victims and perpetrators. We found that from, if you read the scholarship on Rwanda, this was often a recurring event, where people would be very vocal when they stand in their local Gacaca courts about, what happened to them as a victim. And then someone from the audience would literally get up and be like, but you did this to my mother, you did this to my brother, you did, So it's a very fraught space to disentangle. So I don't envy you at all. But I wonder how do you reach a level where you've made a meaningful headway to start demanding or recommending accountability?
So we had to, conceptualize things and define. Hayya Habibti. Thank you for saying. We had to kind of say, so who's a victim? And right off the bat, because there is the insurgency and the counterinsurgency, victims are unarmed civilians who were victimized by whether, the militia and the jihad were fighting in one area. Those who were in a battle are not victims, but those who were not armed and who were also picked on. I mean, building on what Juweria said, the military saying never did, everybody is anti-peace. If you, how do you know who's anti-peace, who's sympathizing, who's, So our definition is somebody who was illegally detained, because people might have been legally detained, illegally detained, unarmed, was a bystander or something. So and it had to be in the era of the mandate of the commission. But you're right, victims became perpetrators. The loudest victims we have are those who were in that military or your police, and them became, say another chapter no by so they had a fallout with Abdi and the regime, and they were jailed. And they are the loudest victims we have. But you have to acknowledge the fact that they were victimized, even though they
fell out of favor.
Exactly. The other thing also for us that we have to kind of untangle is post 2007, when Abala happened, is when deliberately militant then started recruiting from the clans and the communities. So you have now a family member who's your police, and a family member who might be non-NF, and a family member who is militia. So I spoke to a guy who said, I was tortured by a cousin, jailed by a cousin, who's now a clan leader and an elder. And it's like, so so those who fell out of whatever are victimized. Those who were, Hoya Isakti, one day a mother stood up and said, the guy who tortured and the one who got tortured live in the same household. How are you going to find justice for either of them? So it is really murky and messy. But the good, if there is anything good that can come out of it, is people know who did what to whom, when. They're there, and then, the glaring example is going to there was a lady who was kicked in the tummy, had to have a surgery, she was bleeding. When the change happened, she was helped. She went to India, she had a surgery, she came back. The soldiers are still, the security apparatus still think that you have to beat people up. Another soldier kicked her. Now, the Leo police are now regular police. The uniforms changed and they are now police. And she thought, okay, there is a change, I'm going to go complain at the police station. And she went, and the commissioner sitting there was the guy who kicked her in the first place. And he laughs and says, so the other thing that really disturbs me is there's a level of moral decay in that. That people don't realize, that man does not realize what he has done. He's smiling and saying, oh, you're still alive. So the compass of the community, there is an element of a moral decay that I would like to dig deeper into. Because what was normalized was to torture people, to dehumanize, to put a dead body on the middle of the street for days. And if you show any emotions, you will be jailed, to just terrorize people. Where to the extent that a young man now wrote a book entitled, the book's title is Made Kanasiya. When people are killed, tortured, killed in jails, their body will be held hostage. You have to buy the body back.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky and you have money. If not, 3 days later, you can take it now for 1,000. So what has happened to me, it's not just finding the justice, it is even addressing that moral decay of normalizing shit that is inhumane. And people are smiling about it because they have to live. What are they going to do? So perpetrator, victim, very murky.
Very.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to the floor, but I just have one final question for both of you. What are you hoping to, or what are you hoping to see at the end of this process? Like, what if you were to ideally visualize the outcome?
I dream in color every day, but I let Juweria speak to that.
Look like. I mean, I say this because history is a good lesson, and if you go to South Africa today, I've been there. I was there last year and the year before, and when you speak to people, they often speak in pessimism when they talk and reflect on the Mandela era now. When they say, he was a great man, but the reconciliation efforts that him and Desmond Tutu were spearheading have not added any meaningful difference to our lives. My grandmother was living in this hut. She was living in poverty. My mother was living in this hut in poverty. I'm living in this hut in poverty, and I'm giving birth in it. I'm raising children in it. You see?
Yeah.
So for them, justice means the ability to live a dignified life. So how can, if we reflect on that, what tangible outcomes can we hope for that will result in a better quality of life for the people of that region?
I think the immediate thing that comes to mind when you said, what could we hope for, is non-repetition. Because, again, linking back to the kind of country we're talking about, the national context, it is somewhere where mass abuse is normalized. It's part of daily politics. We just heard recently that just in 2021, 2022, around the time of the Tigray War, 1 million people killed in war. That's 1 million people. So we're talking about, unimaginable levels of, casual daily suffering and mass abuse that's completely sanctioned by the state. So it's completely normalized. And the idea, or at least the hope, I think, from following Somali region politics and development, is for Somali region to be its little safe haven, if it can be. Because on one hand, you are connected to the wider country. Of course, you're part of the federal system. But to some extent, for Somalis to really, think about their own features in a distinct sort of way, as a community or as a people who have suffered in very particular ways, because the Somali region has always been governed through a rule of exception, which is characterized by extreme violence. It was always dealt with quite differently. So I think what post-2018 has kind of made people think of is, an alternative future that doesn't have to look like what it used to look like before, even if it means that there are, as Philly said, Ethiopia had essentially nobody's really waiting for Ethiopia to hand them anything or to repair what he had damaged, because it's so deep. But to be left in peace at minimum. And the other thing on thinking about this from the average person or day to day, what strikes me, or what has really stayed with me, is one of the first time I went for my for field work. This person who was in Juweria, the biggest, most notorious detention facility in the Somali region. He spent some years there. He said he encountered some of the strongest people in jail. Some of them went through unimaginable torture, and some of them were former combatants. Some of them were just accused of being rebels. And he said, the things that people survived in jail were. You couldn't imagine. You'd think they'd definitely succumb to these circumstances. But they didn't, because they were thinking about life beyond prison and a future beyond that era, that EPRDF era. And he said some of those men, the strongest I knew in prison, became mentally unwell after prison, not during prison. Mm-hmm. So what does that show you? It really speaks to the conditions, the day-to-day, that the life that a person has to navigate post-violence, post-abuse. It's not just, okay, we've got peace now, there's no armed combat, things are great. And I think it's quite, we really need to check our privileges when we speak about, peace and, reconciliation, these kind of, flowery terms. But think about what that looks like for the average person. Has their quality of life in any way? Somebody will say, look, I've got nothing left to lose. I've lost everything that I could have possibly lost. So what's Nabat going to do for them? Got peace and what? It's why some of the strongest people that survived Juweria were not able to survive in peacetime afterwards. So I think it's really important to center those kind of considerations.
And just to kind of, when Juweria was closed, I think there was over 3,000 people close to 700 or 800 people. When the doors, the gates were open and they were supposed to go out, did not know where to go. They did not know Jigjiga. They were brought from the hinterland, and this place is huge. And they went back and said, they were nomads in the middle of God's green earth, brought one day, haven't seen Jigjiga all their lives, and all of a sudden now you're free, go home. There's no home to go to. There's no, so yes, you have to persevere, and I cannot, as a commission, say, well, we cannot find justice, so let's just all be quiet. But you have to be able to give people hope, and I think that hope is what Juweria touched on, and it's the hope of, the rest of Ethiopia needs to settle its own affairs, but this place needs to be left alone for people to figure out how to even make life sustainable in the face of climate change, in the face of abject state-sponsored poverty. Deliberately taking people's livestock and selling it to the Oromo communities, or selling it, or there is, in Nogok, there is a huge mountain of bones of camels from just one family's camel that got starved to death. So yeah, it's going to be, but we have to start dreaming in color and hope. With a hope and a prayer, we will have a non-reoccurrence and a historical record that prevents this.
And briefly ask a question.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I think it's really important to try and understand some of the atrocities that happened, I guess, in the Northern region, while IDIL was in power. I think what you've mentioned has only really touched the surface, obviously, of the atrocities that happened, and there's some very horrifying stories as to what happened in the Ugandan region, also in Ugandan at the time. And it's absolutely horrifying. Credit to you for documenting these stories and for making sure these people, their voices are heard. I guess at a very human level, what do these people feel when they see their torturers, and their rapists, the people that tortured them and killed their family members walking, freely in Jigjiga, acting without any impunity? And I guess at the very highest level, what do they feel when they see individuals that were in charge of the administration at the time, who's recently been released from prison and is currently, on social media, jet skiing, on holiday, doing Umrah. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that.
Good girl, yeah.
And within the same, I guess, few months, we've seen that there have been mass graves being dug up from in the Juweria region. So what do these people feel at a very human level when they see their perpetrators, roam freely? And I guess my last comment would be, as much as we try to find justice in this world, I think it's important as Muslims to realise, the true justice is the one that's in the akhirah. And as much as we try and do our duty as human beings and as moral people to try and find the justice, and sometimes we might fall short, but I think it's important not to get despondent and know that Ilahi Azza wa Jalla will work, and obviously we're awaiting his justice in his court.
Thank you. Let's take a few more and then we'll come back.
Sure.
Gentleman in the middle of there.
Last time, please. So I'm someone. I guess when hearing the scale of violence that you discussed, I can't help but think that a lot of those people, just for them, simply just is revenge, and they essentially, I imagine, they want perpetrators to feel a tenth of the pain that they felt. So essentially, when it comes to this concept of transitional justice, like how do you reconcile the fact that, okay, you want to bring peace and speak about these people, but ultimately a lot of them just want to inflict pain on those that case, so how do you navigate that?
Maybe over there. Do we have a...
Hi, thank you, FOWSIA and Juweria, for your insights. It's really interesting. What my name's Osman, by the way. What lessons do you think we can apply from the Commission in the Somali region if you look to Somalia, including Somaliland? Because I find it very interesting that obviously you guys chose to focus on state-sponsored violence, post 1991. I wonder what does it look like when you apply it to a different context in which it's Somalis, since this sort of state collapse, Somalis committing human rights abuses against each other. sort of there isn't a state to sort of sponsor that in the same way. How would you apply transitional justice in that particular context?
Okay. Got 3 questions, so perhaps we can have a go at them. Yeah. So,
Take that last
gentleman
one.
over here wanted to know about sort of human impact. How do we navigate revenge violence? And is that question sounded very loaded. How do you apply what you've learned from the Ethiopian context to Somalia? I'm assuming you're talking about Mogadishu and that region, or are you talking about Somaliland as well?
Somali territories.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so thank you for raising that question. But you know what? Somalis are very resilient people. And I think that resilience is rooted in Islam and Iman. They know who did what to whom and where they are. Yet they are willing to not go crazy and start revenge killing. I'm blown away at how much they know about soldier so and so and where he was and what responsibilities he had and what did he do. And so when you really want to create the evidence chain, you will find it. How do they deal with it? I think it's rooted in their Iman. And some of them will tell you, you know, I moved on. People don't hold grudges to the extent that they have to go beat up the person. But there are people who will tell you, I know him, I know what he did. And I'm, going to go after him someday. So to prevent that is, I think, the opportunity to create these spaces. There is no secret, but it was never talked about it publicly. So I think the opportunity that the commission and the work of the commission provides is for us, I'm learning a ton of new Somali concepts. In the sirfe, the way it is no longer, speaking behind closed doors. We are going to point fingers, talk about it. Let's just bring it to the public, because there is some level of healing in that as well.
It's catharsis.
Yeah, and I think the question about the revenge killing also is you want accountability. You want people not to get away with what they did, but you also want some aspects of restorative justice. Because the end goal for me is not jailing thousands and thousands of people. The end goal for me is healing people. And by starting the conversations, by having dialogues, by saying, okay, what would justice look like? I started when I was talking saying that TJs, TRC processes, are social experiments. Those social experiments are going to be rooted in the context that they are going to work or not work in. When you read the TRC literature, successful TRCs, I think, are limited. Their success in some part, not in other. Very interesting one is the Morocco one, where he said, we are not going to talk about perpetrators, but they did the best package of compensation to their people. Because the young king who inherited his father's atrocities were what was being dealt with. So he said, you can tell me what happened to you guys, you can write about it, I don't want to hear who did it. And when you read the literature, they are commended for having the best package of reparations. So I think you want to avoid that revenge killing at a societal level. You want to avoid that collectivizing the guilt of one soldier or two soldiers into an entire clan or whatever. So having a balance between, yes, accountability for egregious human rights violations needs to happen, but also accountability at an individual level. What part of it were you part of as an individual? And how do we get to some restorative justice? What can Somalia, Somaliland, Somali territories learn? I think the biggest lesson for us is to really be honest and talk about what happened. Because I find, before I did TJ for this region, I was doing TJ related research for Somalia proper as well. I went to Garowe, I went to several places. I think we need to start the conversation without using, anaga idinka, whatever, that collective guilt shit needs to go away. Armed groups did harm to people. They did not represent clans. So what can we offer? First of all, we were not focusing on the people, were focusing on state, because the context of the Somali region is slightly different. It was the Ethiopian state that historically did this and continued to do it. So it was easy for us, because when we talk about now what the Leo police did, what who did, there are elders who say to you, أنا ويرو سامعنا إيصا حرتمت دوني يعني إثيوبيا واحد يقول سامعينسي يقول مشغولين إنه ويلاش يركي لعينك سري, which is practical. People have to survive, and post 2007, when deliberately Melis, and by the way, UK trained the Leo police for the Ethiopian government. That was orchestrated so that the community could be divided. Bring your son. Is he an enough? No, then let him be in our payroll and go kill people for us. Otherwise, he will be jailed. So, very insidious ways of breaking down the social fabric of people happened. So it's easier for us to sort of say, let's focus on the state, let's focus on even the armed groups and what they did. We're not talking about, Clan X and Clan Y. Somalia is a little bit more messy than that. Yes, there was state-sponsored violence that happened in Somaliland, and people were, miserable things were done. And one of the things I think when Jama' Iga came to talk about, one of the things that stood out for him was, okay, you guys are focusing on the state. That's a good place to start, because it gets really messy when you talk about, and you have to get away from the collective guilt. We need to acknowledge the collective suffering of people. It's very tricky. Clan is not a unit of analysis, but when you were attacked because of who you were, that needs to be acknowledged. It's like racism. Race is not a unit of analysis, but if something happens to you because of the color of your skin, that needs to be acknowledged. But also the ramifications that people will live with. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about, if you stop beating somebody with an iron rod on the side of the road, and the violence is stopped, and the person is taken to a hospital, yada yada. He said the person's bones are broken. That person has to live with the impact. So for me, the impact of what happened in this region is generationally going to impact people. I'm interested in healing these people. And restorative justice will be a mechanism, but not to sugarcoat, the notorious colonel or whoever that did the bidding, that you had somebody's dead body 3 days, you cannot bury. Some Somali soldiers were guarding that. So we have to be honest about that, and I think honestly talking about what happened without saying it was, random this, random that. No, there was some deliberate things that happened among the Somalis, from the Somali state to some regions, you name it. So I think the lesson is, let's have a conversation about it. That we are not going to sort of say, I know who's the culprit right away. Let's just talk about it. I think that's the best I can come up with.
Ready?
I'll start with a question on IDIL jet skiing on TikTok. Yeah, very disturbing images indeed. I think that is Ethiopian justice. That right there, Abdulkadir jet skiing. That's Ethiopian justice essentially, because he was an instrument of the state at the end of the day. He was fulfilling state objectives, and it's not just that Abdi is free and living his best life. It's the fact that when he was initially jailed, he was not jailed for the mass abuses that he committed against Somalis. He was actually accused for some disruptions that he caused, 4th of August, inciting ethnic violence, quote unquote. Those were some of the charges. Again, really underlining what Somalis have always felt and believed to be the case, which is that their lives do not matter, and it was so clear. He was in jail for what,
6 years.
6 years or so, and then he came out. Again, being a remnant of the previous regime in his case, you know, it didn't take away, like, he wasn't shunned for it or distanced for it. That's because he didn't pose an obstacle to the current regime, and he's not an opposition to the current government, which means from a political perspective, there's no need for them to really underline his dark past or the things that he used to commit, because he's useful. He can be of use to them regardless of the kind of past he's had. So it just goes to show that it's not about ideology at all at any given time. It's literally about the state's objectives, what it seeks to achieve. And I think it's interesting that if he was opposed to the system, or you know, not even a huge opposition, but if he wasn't so vocally in support of the government, trust me, they would be you know, going on about his past, and you know that he wouldn't be in Dubai jet skiing. Let's just put it that way. And I think yeah, I mean, it just him being out, it just highlights you know, how deeply unfair the justice system is, and as you said, people are probably waiting for justice in the akhirah. But there's also an important dimension that Rosie touched on, which is the local. So on one hand, it may be that the average victim in the Somali region didn't actually, at least in the later years when the paramilitary was created in 2008-9, it may be that most people remember their latest perpetrator to be a Somali person, not the image of an Ethiopian soldier. I think it's interesting, back a couple of years ago, the author of the Human Rights Watch report on Juweria, his name is Felix Horn. He was in Jijiga, so him and I went to this jail where, by the way, some of the military officials from the paramilitary are in jail, just some. So the deputy head of the Liu police during the EPRDF was in jail. We met with him, and one of the questions that Felix asked him was, what was the chain of command like? Who ordered you to commit this, or who ordered you to kill so and so? And his response was so interesting. He said, you know, we were expecting him to name a person, a Somali person, and his response was, Hafiz Rais al-Wazara, Ethiopia, literally. He said the Prime Minister's office in Addis Ababa. That's the chain of command. It's really interesting. It's not, you know, it's not a, you know, the Somali region president or the, I mean, you wouldn't think, you know, you don't expect him to give that kind of answer, but he's really, you know, saying, look, this is a state policy. There was a counterinsurgency. We had, you know, a mandate from the government. We were ordered from Addis Ababa. These are the abuses that you need to commit. This is a type of violence, not just you need to commit violence, this is the type of violence you need to commit. This is how you do collective punishment, and this is how people are really going to, this is how you really fight the ONLF ideology. So he said, yeah, these instructions and the manual for how to do them came from Addis Ababa, and that's what we did. And I thought that was really, so you know, thinking about it from that angle as well, I think it brings in the tension between the local, you know, the national, the systemic, and so forth.
And did you want to say maybe one or two things about?
Maybe on the victims, the justice and revenge kind of dynamic. Yes, of course. I mean, I can't speak for the victims specifically, but I imagine that many of them, you know, would only be satisfied with seeing the same type of pain inflicted on their perpetrator. I'm sure that's the case for many. But I think the idea of, you know, justice is, at the end of the day, what works for the person. You know, for someone it may really be about reparations. For someone else, it may really be about accountability. For someone, it may be about truth seeking. You know, and having. For someone, it may be about memorialization. So it really depends on the person. But in terms of, you know, just you know, revenge or kind of, you know, wanting to see the same level of pain inflicted on your perpetrator is not always the case for many. So I know people in Juweria who were there for years and again faced unimaginable violence. They're described having their perpetrator who jailed them essentially a couple of years ago, brought to them, even though they were from the government side. So members of the paramilitary who had tortured them were brought to prison with them. So, I mean, what they could have done was just left them to it, right? They could have just left them alone and just, I mean, they can't do much in that context. They can't really seek revenge as prisoners. But not only did they not, try to seek revenge or even distance themselves from them, but they actually, for the sake of humanity or from the goodness of their hearts, took it upon themselves not to repeat the way that they were treated, but to actually be good to them. And many of the members of the paramilitary, the Lead Police, later on reflected on how they were able to survive jail again based on the treatment that they got from fellow prisoners who they had tortured before in the past. So I think that's also another, not to glorify this type of course, this behavior. I mean, there's no obligation on a victim to treat the perpetrator so well, but it's just to highlight that these are some of the kind of exchanges that we see.